impacts to sand availability, right? If you decrease the amount of sand available to a beach, it's going to erode. And humans are unfortunately impacting the availability of sand to our beaches in many different ways around the state and around the world, such that 70% of all Hawaiian beaches are in a state of chronic long-term erosion. And on the island of Maui itself, because it's subsiding, because Haleakala is such a young volcano, Maui is subsiding, so the rate of sea level rise there is greater than the rate of sea level rise on Oahu. We have as much as 90% of all beaches on Maui experiencing chronic erosion now. We also have sea level rise coming into our lives in ways that we don't recognize. This is salt water coming out of our storm drain system. You know, when we build a road, it's not flat. It has a crown to it, so that rainfall will be shed off into the gutters, and then the rain will run down the gutter and out the storm drain, and our storm drains lead to the ocean. Well, with high tide and a rising sea level, salt water comes up and floods our streets. Now listen carefully to this movie outside the Waikiki Outrigger Reef Hotel. Those are waves coming up in our storm drain system. This isn't even at high tide. So as sea level sort of slowly and inexorably rises into our lives, we're going to have problems with areas when there are heavy rainfall events. We're going to have flooding that won't have any place to drain. Underneath the lands that we live on in the coastal plain, there's a freshwater aquifer. It's not drinkable, but it sits on salt water. And it goes up and down with the tides. If you put a well in right here, you can watch the water table go up at high tide and down at low tide. So this aquifer is fully communicating with the ocean. And as the ocean rises due to climate change, this aquifer is going to rise. And it's going to flood low-lying areas in our land. For instance, here's a map of western Waikiki and Kaka'ako. This shows the areas that will be flooded by 3 feet of sea level rise due to marine inundation. This shows the same area with groundwater inundation as the water table rises. When the water table breaks through the land surface, it creates a place called a wetland or a swamp. And at first, as the water table goes up and down with the tides, you'll have water filling in an area and then draining out again. This is already happening in Miami and Fort Lauderdale. They have actually engineered swales. They've created low areas and grassed them in, and these will fill as ponds at high tide, and then they'll drain out again. It's the forefront of sea level rise moving into our communities. Here's on the windward side of Oahu, Kualoa region. We have flooded this region with 3 feet of sea level rise. We can see new wetlands forming, not connected to the ocean. So this is not marine flooding, this is groundwater rising and creating new wetlands. Along the shoreline, we have salt water moving up into our aquatic ecosystems and interfering with agricultural practices. There are drainage problems that are going to happen in our communities because when there's heavy rainfall, there's no place for the rain to drain because essentially these portions of the community sit below sea level. Road access is going to be difficult. At first it'll be at the spring high tide each month, and then it'll be at the daily high tide. Wave overtopping with strong trade winds or north swell that wraps around is going to occur. Evacuation routes and shelters at high tide will be useless. And will essentially be producing isolated communities where you can't get in and out because the road is flooded. And this problem is going to develop over decades. It's going to be slow. We'll watch it first as a single episode. 10 years later, we might see it again. But then it will accelerate as sea level slowly rises around our communities. And we'll have flash flooding when heavy rainfall runs out of our steep watersheds and collects at the base, as already happens in Laie. So part of the President's National Climate Assessment that came out last week had a chapter specifically on Hawaii. And a lot of scientists in Hawaii were involved in writing that chapter. There were lots of meetings. It took a lot of effort. And I'd like to just show you the 5 main points that the Pacific Islands Regional Climate Assessment came up with. One is that we're going to see changes to our marine ecosystems. This will involve warming of the ocean and acidification of the ocean. Now, there was great news recently in Nature magazine where they found that certain coral communities in tide pools in American Samoa which, are capable of experiencing and surviving in water temperatures of 35 degrees centigrade. This is extremely hot water. So it seems like there are some coral species that may be able to adapt to this problem. And it's the first glimmer of hope we have that our reefs are not going to be wiped out by climate change. There's going to be decreasing freshwater availability. And in fact, we've already seen an 18% decrease in rainfall in Hawaii over the last 30 years. However, that might be related to a short-term climate effect which occurs on a decadal scale. We don't know to what degree climate change is behind the decrease in rainfall that we've seen. And maybe you saw the news today or yesterday that we've actually come out of a drought. We went through this past year and emerged out of a drought, which is very good news. There's going to be increased stress on native plants and animals. You know, as the temperature rises along the sides of our shield volcanoes, and as our upper forests experience increasing heat, the ecosystems there will get pushed to the peaks of our ridges, and then they'll have no place to go. It also brings in mosquitoes that need warmer temperatures, and they carry with them avian malaria, and this problem is already taking place. Rising air temperature, changing rainfall, increased evapotranspiration are going to lead to overall drying of our islands. We've recently completed at the university a number of computer studies of what the island's rainfall will look like over the course of this century. And the general agreement is that there'll be net drying, but that wet areas might get wetter, and dry areas are going to get drier. Most of our islands consist of dry areas, and the wet areas tend to be restricted to the high elevation ridges. Sea level is rising, threats to lives. So I'm just about done. And I really want to end on a positive point, that this is actually an opportunity for us to have a second industrial revolution, for us to leave our children a world better than the one that we came into. And I actually see that this is starting to happen, even in the United States, despite the apparent debate in the media. The U.S. has doubled its renewable energy and is on track to double it again in 5 years. Renewable energy now accounts for about half of all the new electricity generation in our country. U.S. carbon pollution has fallen to its lowest level in 20 years, and this is largely because of tighter gas emission standards in our automobiles. And they're going to tighten up even more. We're required 10 years from now to have an average gas emission or miles per gallon of a little over 54 miles per gallon. 35 states and over 1,000 cities have defined renewable energy targets in place, and certainly Hawaii is at the forefront of this. And the Environmental Protection Agency, now that it's been confirmed by the U.S. Supreme Court that they have the authority, is issuing new carbon pollution rules for power plants. And coal-fired power plants, which are the dirtiest, are working hard on technologies so that they can continue to provide us with electricity and capture the carbon dioxide that they produce and sequester it somehow. So these rules, as tough as they are, and they haven't come out yet, as tough as they're going to be, they're pushing the coal industry to develop new technology. Federal and state adaptation plans and partnerships exist, especially in Hawaii. We have close partnership between federal and state agencies and offices. So I'm going to wind it up. If you're interested in learning more, I've written a book called Climate Change, What the Science Tells Us. It's published by Wiley Press. It's written in what I think is layman's language. You might tell me differently if you get it, but if you just Google climate change and my last name, you can find it on Amazon. I want to thank you for your time, and I want to remind you that 40 years from now, children will live in a world that's shaped by our choices. And I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you very much.